My friends, I am going to read with you here the joint press statement signed by myself, Federal Deputy Eduardo Bolsonaro, and also by journalist Paulo Figueiredo, under the title, Sooner or Later, the Bill Comes Due. The letter from President Donald J. Trump to the Brazilian president is clear, direct, and unequivocal, and it reflects what we have been denouncing for a long time. Brazil is deliberately distancing itself from the values and commitments it shares with the free world. For decades, Brazil has been part of the international democratic community led by the United States. This participation brings privileges, but it also requires minimum standards of civilization, such as respect for human rights, due process of law, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and the holding of transparent elections with broad participation from the opposition. In recent months, we have maintained an intense dialogue with officials from President Trump's administration, always with the aim of accurately presenting, with documentation, the reality that Brazil is experiencing today. The letter from the President of the United States only confirms the success in conveying what we have been presenting with seriousness and responsibility. All warnings have been given to Brazil through diplomatic channels, public statements, letters, congressional hearings, and private meetings. The response from the Brazilian authorities was scorn, laughter, irony, and even more seriously, the decision to double down. While the Supreme Federal Court and Minister Alexandre de Moraes were racking up human rights violations against journalists, against citizens and residents of the United States, they were also targeting the main opposition leader, former President Jair Bolsonaro, denying him the most basic guarantees of legality, defense, and presumption of innocence in the form of a sham, almost summary trial in a court of exception. In response to the visa restrictions for violators of freedom of expression recently announced by the American government, the Supreme Court decided to retaliate. Already in the week following the measure, the court scheduled and decided on a partial repeal of the Internet Civil Framework, a move that makes it impossible for American social networks to operate normally in Brazil, a direct attack on freedom of expression with global consequences. Meanwhile, Lula doubled down on a series of anti-American diplomatic blunders, with angry statements from himself, his ministers, and even the First Lady, as well as deliberate moves to get closer to authoritarian regimes like China and Iran. Ignoring warnings from the Trump administration, he insisted on expanding the BRICS and even criticized the United States for neutralizing Iran's nuclear program, a global threat. None of this would have happened under Jair Bolsonaro's presidency. President Trump's decision is clear. The commercial, diplomatic, and institutional relationship with Brazil is no longer balanced and beneficial to the United States and needs to be reassessed in light of the abuses committed by its leaders. Since the beginning of our international efforts, we have tried to avoid the worst, prioritizing that sanctions be applied individually, focusing on the main person responsible for the abuses, Alexandre de Moraes. Sanctions that will very likely be further implemented, without ruling out their expansion to also include his direct supporters. However, recently, President Trump correctly realized that Alexandre de Moraes can only act with the backing of a political, business, and institutional establishment that goes along with his authoritarian escalation. The American president understood that this establishment also needs to bear the cost of this venture. That is why, starting from August 1st, Brazilian companies that wish to access the largest consumer market on the planet will be subject to what can be called the Moraes Tariff. This is an opportunity to choose. Will we follow the path of freedom, prosperity, and sovereignty like the United States, or will we become a controlled and submissive society similar to China, so admired by the Supreme Court? We appeal to the Brazilian authorities to avoid escalating the conflict and to adopt an institutional solution that restores freedoms. It is up to Congress to lead this process, starting with a broad, general, and unrestricted amnesty, followed by new legislation that guarantees freedom of expression, especially online, and holds public officials accountable for abuses of power. Without these urgent measures, the situation is likely to worsen, especially for certain individuals and their supporters. There are 3 weeks left to avoid a disaster. It's time for those responsible to put an end to this authoritarian adventure. May God bless Brazil, and may God bless the United States of America. The letter is signed by me, Federal Deputy Eduardo Bolsonaro, and journalist Paulo Figueiredo. A big hug. God bless you.